In this video series, we'll be looking at an introduction to Vue.js, right? And we will be beginning from a quick overview of the environment setup all the way to making API requests to a backend using HTTP. So before we get started, you need Node installed. It's just nodejs.org, and then there is you can go to downloads, and then you simply download Node.js, and then you have to install it, all right? Another tool we're going to use is Visual Studio Code, and you simply come to the website and you download the software. Once you do this, you install it. There may be some plugins that it recommends that you install, but once you start creating Vue projects, just go ahead and install those plugins. It will make the programming a bit easier by providing things like code completion and so on. All right. So let's begin. Now, if we come to Vue.js.org and we come to install, we can see that there are different ways of creating. There are different ways of doing this. All right. You can use the online playground, which um, provides this interface which you can do some Vue programming without having to um, create your own project. And but what we're and there are many other ways to do Vue. So for example, I believe if we scroll along here, you can actually just import a JavaScript file, this JavaScript file, and then you can use Vue in any project. All right. So there are many different ways of using Vue, but what we are going to be looking at is the Vue single file components using the composition API. All right. So in order to do that, once you have npm installed, you copy this. We're going to be using the latest version of Vue in this case. All right. If you want to use a specific Vue version, you can put the Vue version there. All right. Come here, we go into, we select a folder, and we're going to open the terminal here, and then we're going to execute this command. Now, when this runs, it's going to ask you a bunch of questions. So for example, it's going to ask you things like this. It's going to ask you about the project itself, right? So we'll call it IT 2201. Whether you want to use TypeScript, no, we'll be using JavaScript. Whether you want to do JSX, no. Should we add Vue router for single page application development? Yes, we won't use this in our first project, but we'll add it now. This is for state management. Yes. Do we want unit testing? No. We don't want end-to-end testing. These are things that you would have in a production version of Vue. We want ESLint for code quality. Um, yes. Do we want Prettier for formatting? Yes. And we do want the DevTools. All right. Now it will provide you with the instructions. So if we come back to this folder and we refresh, we can see the project folder is created here, right? So what this is telling you, cd, this is telling you to go into the folder and run these commands. Now, you don't have to do it how I'm doing it. You can simply go into this folder and then run the commands, all right? So let's do it that way. For those who aren't too familiar with the terminal, we'll come into this folder, and then from here we open terminal again. Then we type npm install, and once that completes, we will run npm run dev. All right. All right. So once the install completes, this is what it's going to look like. From here, you simply we can do npm run dev, and this will run our view application. And this is the host and port where we can find the application. All right. And here we'll have our DevTools in a separate window. So, so what we want to do is go here, you press Control and click, and this is the view application loaded here. So the project was now created. Now this opens a project in the browser. Notice this is our code, right? It's not from an external website. The program, when you create a view project, it just provides you with this setup, all right? This default code. Um, and by the way, we're using Vue 3 for this project. So the next part is that we have to be able to see the actual source code. We want to see the code itself that we wrote. To do that, you have to open Visual Studio's code in this folder. Now, there are many ways to do this. If depending on how you install Visual Studio's code, the easiest way you can simply come here, open Visual Studio's code like this. Then you can come to File, you can come to Open Folder, and then you can navigate to that folder, all right, and open it. Another way, depending on how you set up your Visual Studio's code, you can simply right click and go to more options and open with code, all right, and it's going to open that folder. So that is how you create a very basic Vue project. All right, so provided that you've already created a Vue application, just a basic setup, just run the very basic Vue commands, and the initial project is created. A whole bunch of files would be created, and you would have a view or a user interface that looks something like this once you have the project running. All right. So in this video, what we will cover is that provided that you have, you know, that you have the project running and you've created an initial Vue project, uh, how do you uh, get an understanding of what all these files are? As starting out, how do you know which files you can edit and which files you shouldn't edit? And what's the folder structure like? All right. So this is the root. And so this is the first drop down. So the .vs code, you can ignore that. The node modules, you can ignore that, right? The readme, you can ignore that. The vid.config, you can also ignore this for now. We'll get to this later on. Package.json, you could ignore. This package.json is similar. It's the configuration file for the Node Packet Manager, similar to how the POM file is a configuration file for Maven Java applications. You could ignore the package.log.json. You could ignore the JSON config. You can ignore the prettier rc.json as well. You can ignore the git ignore. You can ignore this one as well, right? So, so the one we will look at, however, is index.html. All right. Now, you won't necessarily need to edit this file other than to change the icon, the favicon, but and maybe the title. But essentially, what how Vue works, right, is that remember Vue is a front-end JavaScript framework for building front-end web applications, right? What Vue does, we do that JavaScript can manipulate the document object model, right? So what Vue does, where you have this div app equal ID, all of the view processing is going to be done on this div here, right? And all Vue is really going to be doing in the background is using JavaScript to manipulate the DOM within this div. And that's all of the Vue magic is happening within this single div, all right? And So you don't really have to touch this particular index.html file. Just remember that view connects to this div with this app ID and then uses the DOM and JavaScript to manipulate the entire website. So if we start with public, this is where you have your public resources such as your images and so on. As you can see, the favicon is in here, right? So the images and so on that you want to display on the web page, if there's any built-in audio or anything like that, you put it in this file. Then you have your source folder. This is the main folder of the project, right? In the assets folder is where you can put your CSS, your JavaScript, and so on. Well, any additional CSS that you would have, or any additional icons that you want to use inside of the project. And then we have the main.js. So the main.js can be considered the entry point into the application. All right. So everything here is just a setup view. This CSS import that you're doing here imports the CSS for the entire application. And every other thing that you see here is just to set up the Vue project, right? And we'll touch on these two things in a later video. Here, where we have app.mount, this is where you're mounting Vue to this div or the element with this ID. That's what this is saying. This creates a Vue application, and this adds support for state management, and this adds support for adding a router to the application. Then you simply create the application, right? Then you mount the application to the HTML. That's all that's happening here. Now, from that, let's close this. We then find this file with this weird extension, app.vue, right? This is a new extension. So Vue files have a .vue extension, right? These are Vue single file components, and they have a .vue extension. It's called a single file component because you have your JavaScript, your HTML, and your CSS all in the same file. And that's why it's called a single file component. All right. And these Vue single file components have a .vue file extension. All right. Now, and this is basically what it looks like. You have a script section for your JavaScript, you have a style section for your CSS, and then you have a template section for your HTML. So and this is let's go through the rest of the folders. Now, Vue, like I said, we'll be using the single file components approach. Now, a component is simply a functional section of a web page. All right. So a component can be as large or as small as you want, but the idea of Vue and many other front-end frameworks is that you wouldn't simply create one massive web page. You would divide the web page into sections, and those sections can have components, right? There are a whole bunch of different techniques when it comes to deciding what's a component and how components should be integrated, but that's not the scope of our video. Just understand that for this project, you'll have a web page. The web page will have multiple sections, and each section is going to be a separate component that you then integrate, right? So all of your components will come in this folder called, well, components. So as you can see, these are all components here, right? So these are all components. And you can see they all have that .vue extension. We have three hello world, the welcome and welcome item. We're going to skip router and store for now, and we're going to come to view. Now a view in views in Vue, VIEWS, are more like pages. Um, so a component is a section of a page, and a view is considered to be an entire page. So a view can actually be a combination of multiple components, right? So that's how that is done. A view is mainly a combination of components, right? So what you would do is you would create your component in the components folder, and when you want a page to display that component, you would do that. You would create another component within the view folder and import the component from the components folder. That's what's happening here in, if you take a look at, not this one, sorry, at home view, it imports the welcome from the components folder and then includes it in its HTML, right? So if we look at this page, this is actually uh, the page that initially loads here, right? And as you can see, it imported the hello world component. It also added some other things, all right? Now, similar to object-oriented programming, where in OOP, when you create a new class, that class becomes a new type. The same thing applies to view components, all right? Any single file any view component, whether it's in the components folder or in the view folder, once you create it, you can then use it as a new HTML element. So if we come to our components folder, we can see we have a component here called hello world.view, and then we're seeing that in the app component, we're then using it after importing it. All right. So any component that you create then becomes sort of like a new HTML element that you can then use, right? So um, let's come here, right click, we can come to inspect, and we have access to all of our tools. We have the elements, we have the console, the source, the network, and so on, which is basically, standard. Now there is another one that we'll get access to. If we click here and we CTRL, we follow this link, it gives us access to view dev tools. All right. Now what this is doing, it's showing us the view element, the view aspects of our web page. All right. So as you can see, it's saying that um, we have two pages. This has to do with view router, right? So this is our about page, right? And this is our home page. So it's switching between pages here. And the other thing it can show us are our components and the component hierarchy, which is very important. So we can see that our root component is that app component. That app component then includes our hello world component. The hello world component includes two router connections, and then within a router view, we have our about component, all right? So what it does, it allows you to see the relationship, the entire component hierarchy, similar to where you have elements, which shows you the structure of your HTML. When you select components, it is showing the structure of your view application, right? We'll get into using these tools as we continue. All right. So if I have a view project set up like this, of course I don't want any of this stuff, right? How do we delete this and basically so we can start our own project, right? So let's begin. So to do that, we come here and we start deleting the things we don't need. So first of all, we'll delete everything in the components folder because we'll be making our own components and we don't want any of these. All right. Then we're going to delete everything in the views folder as well. All right. Of course, this means that our application is going to stop working, right? One moment. This is going to stop working, right? Because then if we come here, Okay, this gives us access to the DevTools, right? So if we come here, we're going to see that, we have a lot of errors, all right? That's fine because we deleted a whole bunch of things. So our view is it's no longer working, all right? Now the first error it's telling you is that it fails to load the URL source views home, and that this error occurred in source router index.js. So in this file, it's telling you that it can't find a particular file, all right? Now this is the view router. We'll touch on this later on, so let's get that. It's saying that this home view component doesn't exist, all right? Now if we come to app.js, app.view, we can see that this one here is the culprit that is importing, for example, hello world, and we have no hello world, right? So we'll get rid of hello world. We aren't using the view router either, right? Um, so we can get rid of this, and we can actually get rid of all of this, the entire thing here, and this as well, and we we don't have any style, so we'll get rid of all of this. We can actually delete this entire style section, right? So we're down to this now. Let's check this file. Let's see, we still have this here, so we'll get rid of that, and we can delete this as well so that this becomes empty. So we are now here. Good, we basically stripped down the entire thing. Right, and refresh. Good. Check here. We no longer have the error, right? But of course, there's absolutely nothing on our page because, well, we deleted everything, right? And it's saying that there's no match. We'll cover the router a bit later on. All right. So remember the entry point is going to be this file, all right? So the JavaScript entry point, the part where the part where the view itself loads is this file. And the first component to be loaded is going to be this one, app.view. So to make sure it works, we can just say div, and we put some code there, and it appeared on the screen. All right. So this is the view dev tool here, right? It appeared on the screen, which means it's working. All right. So we're good there. So we're good there. So we know that this thing is loading. I think we have some CSS somewhere. Yeah, we have some CSS here that we don't want, so we delete. This is the color palette. Oh, this is the color palette from view. Root, background, da, 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 da. We don't want any of these stuff. Delete. We delete this file as well, and this CSS file. We come back here. We shouldn't have to refresh this. Where did our view go? There's an error. So there's an error in the CSS. So whenever there's an error that occurs, you have to be familiar with this, with the DevTools in the browser. Come to inspect, and all of the errors would be here in console, right? Um, if you click on warn, you're only going to see the warnings. If you want to see the errors, you can come here, and if you want to see all the messages, you can come here, right? So since it's failed to load a particular resource, this one assets the main JS file, it can't find it, all right? And if you come here, you're going to see that this file it was accessed in the main.js file, and it can't find the main CSS file. So we come to here, we look for this file, we get rid of it, save, and there we have our view set up. So this is where you start. Um, so now we have basically a blank view project, all right? There is no, uh, there is nothing here that was that is displaying anything on our page, and our view project still works. So the next thing is how do we then go ahead and create our own components? So here we have a few projects that was initially created using the view through npm using the create command for view, and that generates a whole bunch of other files. We gutted all of those files to the point where our view project just simply looks like this, right? It just displays hello world, which we added in the app.view. All right. Now again, in this index.html, you have this div with id app, and then in main.js, you're creating a view project and you're a view app, and you're mounting that app to the HTML element with this ID. After that, Vue then manipulates the document object model using JavaScript in order to actually create the Vue website. So the entire Vue website, despite the fact that you're writing HTML, is actually using JavaScript, right? Transpiles down to JavaScript. The entry point now for your job for your JS is here. All right, so the entry point for the JS part of the application, if you want to do anything to the Vue instance before, or anything to the app instance before the app actually launches, you can do that here. And the actual visual part of the application, its entry point is app.view. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a very simple um, application, a very simple application, right? So we'll start by creating a component. Then we're going to import that component inside of our app.view. So we come to components, we right click, we go to new file, and then we have to name this component, and then we have to give it a .view file extension. All right. So let's begin. Let's just call this counter. We'll keep it very simple. Counter.view. Once you do this, you need to create a script tag. And what you want to do is to add the word setup here. This, done. That's finished. Then we need to create template. So that's a structure. This is a structure for our JavaScript. And this cannot be empty. All right. So we can put a div here and just say contour, the name of the component. All right. And that's our initial, this is our first component. Now next we need to import this component into our app component. So we come here inside of the script tag, we say import the name of the counter, and there. All right. Count. Okay. So this is just say that it's, you declared it but you didn't use it, and then we will replace right below here. We will simply put counter like that. Right. So we created our view component, then we're importing it in the app component, and then we're using it here. As a result, Contour then displays in our screen. Now if we click on this icon, on this little thing there, and then we come to components, here are components. One moment. Good. We can see we have our app component, and then within the app component, we have our counter component, all right? So it's showing you the component structure here as well. So one moment, let's just put this together. All right, so close this again. So we created this file, this component with the script empty, and then we create the template. Template cannot be empty, so we just added this counter, and this is the counter.view component. In app.view, No, we imported the counter component within our script section, and then we were using it within our template section. All right. So what we can do now is let's talk about the different things we can do with Vue. All right. So the script section is what we're going to mainly be focusing on now. So any application will have variables. All right. So in JavaScript, this is just JavaScript we're doing here. So we're going to create a constant variable, and we're going to call that constant variable num. All right. And we're going to assign num 0. But now this is just saying that see can contain at most once. It's fine. We only have one in here. I'm not. This is just some. It's said that it's declared, but it was never used. Right. So that's not an issue. We created it, but we didn't use it. All right. So within Contour now, let's go ahead and let's create a little div, and that div is going to display num. All right. So the way we do that is we do this, and as you can see, it displayed. Let's see, number. In fact, let's call it count. So if you want to display the value of some variable in JavaScript, you create in Vue, sorry, in a Vue single file component, you create the variable within the script section, and within the template section, you can reference it this way, right? You put the brackets, the double brackets, and you put the name of the variable inside that bracket, all right? Now let's go ahead uh, and try to create a simple um, contour, all right? So to create a simple contour, well, the first thing we're going to need to do is to create the first thing we're going to need to do is to create the web page. All right, let's create the visual aspect of it. So we're just doing this to get the HTML part. So I guess we can just use a simple button. In fact, this is all we really need, right? A button, and we can get rid of this. Good. When we click this button, we want to, we want this counter value to change, right? So in Vue, there are various events that you can add. Now, by the way, if you come to the Vue web page itself, you just want to ensure that the composition API is selected. And here it has basically every possible thing you can probably want to know in terms of getting started with Vue. All right. So what we'll be doing is doing event handling. That is, we want to react to a click event on a button. Now, as we know, there are many different ways. There are many different events, right? So in Vue, there's a long way and a short way of doing event handling, right? You can use v dash on colon, then the name of the event, or you can use the at sign and the name of the event. All right. This is the version that we're going to be using. Good. So all we need to do now is to simply say at click, and then from there, what we can do is simply count plus plus. All right. So what's happening here, right? We're saying that when the click event occurs, we want to execute this piece of code, all right? And this piece of code is going to be used to increase the value of const by 1. All right, so that's what's happening here. We can add another but now. We then do decrease and then we reduce this value here, right? So now we have two. So now we have two buttons, all right? And we have const, which equals to 0. Refresh the page. Now you notice that when we click this, it's not working, right? So as you see, when we click increase or decrease, it's not working. Despite the fact that we have the variable call count here, despite the fact that we have when the increase button is clicked, we have plus plus that would increase count by 1. And then when the decrease button is clicked, we are reducing count by 1, right? So from that perspective, this code seems right. Now, the reason it's not working is because Vue has a concept of reactivity, all right? And this is the very important part of Vue. Now, when you're building a traditional MVC application similar to what we did with JavaFX, whenever um, the state updates, which in this case would be the variable count, the Vue doesn't automatically update, which in this case which would be line 7, right? And the only way to actually do this update is to do it manually, right? Where when the state updates, right? We have to give this an ID, get the element by ID, and then manually update this text here within this div. All right. What Vue reactivity does, it uses the observer pattern to synchronize the state and the view. So whenever the state updates, the view automatically updates, and whenever the view updates, the state automatically updates as well, right? Now, to get access to that reactivity, you need to make a slight modification to how you declare variables. So variables that are declared in this way are that you're seeing here are non-reactive. All right. So to make it reactive, you need to wrap this into a call, the call ref. Right now, ref now needs to be imported. So to do this, you simply type import ref from Vue, and that will do the import. All right. Now, this const is now reactive, all right? So let's see, refresh, and here we have the page. And now it works, all right? So reactivity is a very, very important, it's a very, very important aspect of Vue. So basically, all the variables that we are going to be declaring are going to be declared using ref, which is going to make it reactive, which is what we want for basically all of our variables. Probably 90% of them are going to be reactive. All right. So this is a very simple application, but it does demonstrate the way you integrate components. It does demonstrate the way you display aspects of the state to the web page itself, and it does demonstrate the basics of Vue reactivity, which is very important to understand. Now, you could also create a function instead of having this the way it is, and we could just set function, and we can say increase, right? And then here, now when you're dealing with reactive variables, you can't simply say count plus plus, right? This isn't going to work. All right. First of all, const is a constant variable, which means you can't change the value. Now, even if it wasn't a constant, this wouldn't work because once you set the variable to be reactive, it's no longer a primitive variable. This reference to ref here actually returns an entire object, all right? Um, and in order to access the primitive variable, you actually need to say dot value, all right? So it's count dot value plus plus. It is a bit strange, but you can get used to it very quickly. And then here you call the increase method there, right? Notice I didn't need to do this. I didn't need to do a method call like that, right? Instead, you can just put the name of the method. Both of these things would work. And then we can do the same thing for a decrease. Now, you can expect to make errors a couple of times when it comes to not putting the value, but that's fine. You will get over that pretty quickly. And when you don't have it, you'll be able to notice errors. So, for example, the ID, as you can saw just now, actually put it in for me. All right. So that's a very basic, a very very basic Vue project. Now there are many other things that you can actually do with Vue, and there are many other things to learn. But before we continue, you already have the concept of components already established. And but before we continue further using Vue with basic HTML, with using basic HTML, what I would want to introduce you to instead is actually using Vue component libraries, which can provide out of box a wide variety of different components, which makes our Vue development a lot easier. So in this video, what we are going to look at is basically how to import third-party components. All right, we saw before that you can create your own component and you can import one component into another. What we'll be looking at here in this video is a specific third-party component framework. All right. So what these frameworks do is that they provide some pre-built component for you to then use. And there are many of them. For example, so this is one, this is Element Plus, here we have another one, and there are many of them, right? And you can simply Google Vue 3 component frameworks and you can see a wide variety of them. The one that we are going to be focusing on is Vuetify 3, all right? So the website is vuetifyjs.com. So once here, you can click on getting started, and then we're using Vuetify Titan because that one supports um, that one supports Vue 3. All right. So now what we need to do is to simply we're using npm, so we need to run npm create Vuetify. All right. Come to the command line, npm create Vuetify, and it asks us to provide the application with a name, and it's asking us what we would like to do. In this case, the basis to use Vuetify and the router. Essential, we'll be using Vuetify, the router, and state management. We want TypeScript, no. We'll use npm, right? Because that's what we're using, and it's going to uh, scaffold our application. So once this completes loading, similar to when we created our first Vue project, it's going to create a project with a bunch of files and some starter code for us. And just as before, we'll then have to go through that and remove some of the files so that we can then go ahead and build our application. So once it completes, this is what it's going to look like. And this is the project here, IT 2200-2. We can see, go into that project folder, and then we can open Visual Studio's code in that project folder. Then we can open that project or that folder using Visual Studio's code, right? So this is what you will get once you create that project. Now to run it, we can say npm run dev, and this should run our project. In this case, it's on localhost 3000. All right, so we're on localhost 3000 here. So we can now come to localhost 3000, and this should load our project. Right. All right. And this is the project setup that they give you, all right, when your application first loads. Now let's go through the same process of removing the things we don't need or the things that we would like to change. So here you have um, components, you have layouts, you have plugins, you have styles, you have views. All right. So here we have the layout of the application, and here we have the the main view of the application, right? And we'll cover these later on. So we have one component here called hello world, and this component is probably this main page that you're seeing here. So what we're going to do, we're going to start by deleting this file, which brings it like this. Then we are going to delete the home. Then we have three files here. We have the this app bar, which displays this bit here. Then we have default. Then we have so the default, as you can see, actually imports the app bar. And then finally, we have the view, which is the one that has the main router, right? So what I think we should actually do, I would say for now, is to leave these three, because essentially what these three do is that they provide scaffolding for the application, right? Particularly this one, for example, um, it provides the app bar at the top, and you have an app and you may want that app bar, so you then come to app bar and then customize this file to change that. Then you would have the view, which is the main layout of the page, which is where your views that will be in your page will actually go. And then you have the default, which combines the two. So we'll leave these two for now, but this might still result in some issues um, in our application. Now, when you're doing this, you want to ensure that this dev tool is available from here, and you want to check your errors, right? Um, so, so there's a problem in the source views home.view, which is there's no such files. Let me just try to refresh this. HTTP source view. Okay, so it's trying to load this file and can't find it. That's what's happening, right? That's because we need to come into our router now, which is where we have this stuff, and save. Um, let's leave this as it is, because for our project we need a page, right? So in fact, what we should do is just go and add back, add home.view, because we need a page, right? We need at least one component anyway. So setup and then template like this, and the template cannot be empty. So we put a div and we say home, right? We then come back to our interface. This should automatically reload. I'm not sure why it's not updating the page. Let me see what's happening here. That was strange. Let's see. Let's just make sure that this works. So it should have live reloads when you change your code and you save. Okay, good. When you save your code and you save your code and you change your code and you save, this should automatically update. All right. So let's quickly run through the basic structure of this project, just so you can have an understanding of how the folders are structured. All right. So in this case, it added a new folder called layouts. Plugins you can ignore for now, and styles, well, that's where your style sheet goes, right? But it added a new folder called layouts. Now, in any project, right, you're going to, in any web project, you're going to have a structure, right? So the general structure is that if I have a web page that looks like this, in many cases, I'm going to have a section for the header, basically, right? I may have a footer, right? I may have a panel on this side, right? And the actual content that I am going to be developing will be inside of this box. Good. So what Vuetify is trying to do, right? What Vuetify is trying to do is it's trying to provide you with a way to set this up, and set this up for all of your pages. All right. So that's what the layout file is doing, the layout folder is doing, right? So if we come to app bar, this is the header at the top. If we come to view, so what we have here, this is the sets up the infrastructure for changing what is in the middle here, right? So you can use that layout folder to set up the structure of the entire web page and specify which section should be different across the different pages. And that's the infrastructure that is being set up here. So app bar sets up the app bar, and view sets up this central area here so that it would keep changing as the route in your URL changes. We'll talk about that later on. And default sets up the default layout for all of them. All right, so it's going to show the app bar, and then below the app bar is going to show your page. Now, if we come to the router, and we'll talk about what the router is in later on, the router is saying that when the URL is ends with this, or when you just add the base URL, that's just the website. When the URL ends with the domain name extension, right? We don't have one, but just after the port, that is basically here, right? We don't have a domain name extension, just after the port. When it enters this forward slash, right? What it should do is that it's going to match this rule, and you should import the default layout, right? Then what it's saying is that inside of the default layout, you then want to import, if there's no further change to the path, you then import the home view. As a result, you're basically saying import the default layout, which adds the app bar, then import the home view, which is going to change the content, the dynamic content area of the screen. But we'll talk about view router more once we get there. All right. But for now, because this views.home is included as a child of this rule here, the the bar is going to show at the top, and any code you add will be added below that, right? But we'll cover a bit more later on that. All right, so what exactly is Vuetify? So Vuetify is a view component framework, right? It provides you with some components out of the box. So if I come to components here and I scroll down, you can see a whole list of things. These things are all pre-built components that you can then easily reuse. So for example, this would be the component for tables. And what it's showing you here are all of the different things that, all different ways in which you can use tables. And then we have the real table is actually this one called data tables. And this is just, let's see, data on display. And it's showing you different table options that are available. So the way this works is, let's start with something very simple. Let's start with something like a button. All of these are components, but we will not go through all of them. But let's just start with the button. Buttons, good. So these are the different types of buttons that are available. That's what you're seeing as you scroll through this, all right? And um, to actually use these, for any one of them, but not just this one, to actually use them, all you need to do is to simply click on this icon here. Sorry, where is it? You're going to see this icon here, which shows the code, and then it shows you the code for the button, right? Which is the v.btn. And this is what's happening. And then it shows you how you can customize the button using these attributes. We'll talk about these. These are actually called props in Vue, but in HTML they're basically called attributes, so we'll use the term attributes for now. Now, another thing is that in Vuetify, it supports a structure for your web page by having a container and dividing that container into rows and columns, all right? So a container, right, provides you with a grid structure that you can then use to lay out your web page. So the container can contain a row, or it can contain rows like this, and then the rows itself can then be divided into columns, right? So it provides a way to lay out elements of their web page, and we'll cover that in a bit. So in the previous example, we created a basic contour. Let's do the same thing, but this time let's do that in Vuetify, right? So for the contour, we're going to need two buttons and we're going to need an input field, all right? So since we're here, let's just start with the, in fact, let's start with the button. So so we want a button, right? And let's see, we'll start with by creating a, oh, it's over there. Let's start by creating our component. So we come to component, right click, new file, we call this contour.vue. We create the script section, ensure you add setup here. Then we create our template section. Like this. And we add a little div here just to make sure it's working. And we say contour. Good. It doesn't display on the screen because the next thing we need to do is to import that counter inside of this home. So we say import counter from, this is going to be, so right now we're inside of the view folder, right? So to get to counter, I believe we can do at, we can go up one, then go into components, and from components, counter, right? Then instead of having, let's leave that there, counter, and there, right? So this one is actually coming from the counter itself. And we should have access to view DevTools here. Let's see, I'm not sure. Here we have the DevTools. And you can see that, sorry, this will be inside the view, main, router, home. And within home, you can see we have counter here, all right? So that's working. So now let's go ahead and inside of counter, create our little, our counter, all right? So this is how you create a very basic view button. Right? So this is the basic view button here. So we just do that button, and then that should appear there on our screen, right? So that's our first button. We can simply replace with increase. And we can then add another button called decrease, all right? That will be our second button. And I believe in between these buttons, we would like to have an input field. So that input field is, I think it's called a text field. And this is what the basic view text field looks like, right? Beautify text field. And let's see, did it display? So here we have our counter now. Now, as you can see, the input field that we added took up that entire width, all right? So let's introduce a very simple mechanism for um, controlling that. So one of the things we can do is that we could use the something to contain it, right? Um, and to do that, to put them side by side, well, we can use a card if you want. You can put them inside of a card. This is what cards look like, all right? And then we can also, and by the way, to use this, you simply scroll, you click on this, and you see the code that created it. And if you want to see the script, the JavaScript part, you click on this. This is using the options API, but it's not that difficult to figure out. And let's see, instead of using this, let's just use containers, right? So we can replace this. Let's come here and we say v dash container, and we say v dash row. And by the way, this I believe is found in, where is it? Application layouts. We're looking for the grid. Let's see, containment button sheets. Um, data grids. So this is where you learn about the container and the columns and so on, right? So if you go there, you'll see something like this. So as you can see, we have a container, we have a row, And then within that row, we have columns. All right. And each vehicle has something called cols, which gives you the size of the column. Right. And in this case, we have um, columns that are being created as a result of a loop. All right. So what we can do, we can just say v.col. This one calls can be equal to, there are 12 columns, right? So the entire width of the screen is 12 columns. So we'll create a column of size 4, all right? And from there, we put in the first button. Then we can create another column, v.col. Then we say the calls attribute, set that to 4. And then we put in the text field. Then we create a final one. We set this to 4. So they're going to be of the same size, right? Then we put in the decrease button. We save. And as you can see, they're now side by side, right? So there are different ways of laying this out. Good. And we can probably put another v.row here. So the reason it looks like this is because this row is above this one, right? So there are many other ways of containing this, and you should take a look at the grid system, right? It has some very useful information here in terms of how to uh, align your containers, right? Or align your interface. In this case, let's try, for example, using align center. So we have this, copy this over, come to the row, and we switch this to center, right? We got a bug. Let's see. Now, you are required to understand some basic web development stuff. As you can see that if you look at this button itself is just that size, but the column itself is what stretches it to, to that length, right? That's why you're seeing that space there. And basically, it's the same thing for this one, right? All of the elements are aligned to the left of the columns. That is why you have the space here on the right of that button. All right, so let's implement our actual contour. Now, what we need to do here, right, is that we want um, whenever the person hits increase or decrease. In fact, this shouldn't be a label. This should actually just be, what are we doing? This here shouldn't be a label, right? All right, I believe there is a read-only flag here. Good. So it can't change from the user interface, right? Now, what we want to do is when we hit increase, it increases, and when we hit decrease, the value decreases. All right. We need to switch the sides for these buttons. Yes. All right. So we have decrease and increase, and just as before, we are going to create a very basic setup. We're going to have a call count. We're going to use ref and um, do that and 0. Right. Now we need to import ref, so it's import. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And you're importing this from view. Good. So that works. Now we didn't use this variable, so it's going to give an error. Now there is something interesting, right? In fact, let me remove the read only here. So when we want to um, link, for example, an input field. So whenever someone types into this input field, right, we want to be able to capture that user input, right? We already covered how to use, we already covered this. Um, let's just replace this word counter with this. We already covered how to use this, right? And when count increases, count change, when the value of the variable changes, what this place here is going to change. So we did this before. So if I came here and I said add click, I can then say count sub minus minus, and if you hit this, it reduces. And if we say add click here and we say count plus plus, it increases, right? So we covered this already, right? But how do we get input from, let's say, an input field? All right. So there is this two-way binding that occurs in Vue. So essentially, um, let's say I have this input field here, right? And then I have this variable here called count, all right? And what I want is that whenever the user types in this input field, I want this variable to update, right? So in Vue, there is something called a V model, all right? And what the V model does is that it creates a two-way binding between the input field and the variable, right? So when the input field changes, the variable automatically changes, right? And when the variable automatically changes, the input field changes. The benefit of using something like Vuetify is that you don't have to write this connection, right? You can simply create a variable and connect it to the input element using vModel. When the variable changes, the UI will change, and when the UI changes, the variable will automatically update. All right. So the way that works is we simply say v-model and we provide a variable, in this case count. All right. So now, as you can see, it starts at 0. As we increase here, it's increasing, and as we decrease, it's decreasing, right? And if we type in here, you can see that the count is also it's also working, right? Good. And that's now in order to actually get good at Vuetify, what you need to do is to go through the components. Um, it what I would recommend you do is that as you're building your small applications, just look for the components that you want, and then uh, you can, from that perspective, learn it in parts instead of trying to read all the components um, at once. Some people find that to be a bit too much, and if you do that, you will read a lot of things that you're actually never going to use. In this video, we'll cover basic user input and using Vue. So what we have here is a form created using Vuetify, right? Um, the project structure itself is quite simple. We have a home which imports an element and a component called user input. Then we have user input, which is the actual component with the form. All right. Now this may look complicated, but it really isn't. So we're using a container here, a V container we're using here, and it's very straightforward, right? So we have a V container, and I said before, a container. The container, the row, and the column, these are used to divide a page into rows of 12 columns. All right, so that's what it's doing. And if you check out the grid section, there are different ways of laying out the elements, for example, within a grid, right? So we have a container followed by a row followed by a column that is offset um, of 5 columns wide, and it's offset 3 columns, all right? So if we come to our user interface, we can see, if we come here and you hover over this icon, we can see where this is the main and that this is our row. So just outside of our row, this is our container highlighted here, all right? And you can see the container has padding on both sides, right? And the row is actually just in the center. So the content of the container is in the center, and it has a huge amount of padding on both sides, right? Why is that? Well, that's because also it's also the entire page. So that's because we set the container's height to full height. That's 100%, right? And then the row, we're aligning the row in the center, all right? So because of that, this is why we have, when we hover over the container, we have the row there in the center. Now we can see the form is also centered. Now there are many ways to do that. The common CSS way is to give it the size, then set it auto, then set the margin to auto, and that centers it. But in this case, I want to introduce something different. So this here sets the size of the column, all right? So if I am to remove this from 5 and make it 10, as you can see, it gets larger. If I have to make it 1, it gets smaller, all right? So that controls the size of the column. Offset now, if we hover over this column, we can see there's a huge amount of margin there, all right? And if we hover over the row, we can see there's nothing on the right, all right? And the column itself actually takes up the entire left-hand side. So one way of centering it is that remember that each row is 12 columns wide, right? So if I set this thing to 5 columns wide, by default, it's going to be aligned on the left. But then if I put an offset of 3 columns to the left, then it moves, then it puts a space there, right? Which means to the right, you have another 3 columns, right? But 3 and 3 is 6, so that's a left offset. Sorry, the left offset is going to be 3. My width is 5, that's 8. It means that there's a space of 4 columns to the right, right? So what I can do, make this 6, and now there's offset of 3 on the left hand side, plus 6, which is my width, plus another 3, which is going to be 12, and therefore it's centered, right? After that, we have a card. This is why you can see it's elevated, right? The card title, this is where we got to use registration from. Then the card text actually contains the form itself, all right? And then we have the card actions, which contains our 2 buttons. Good. Now, if we want to use this to get user input, what we would do is we would need to use vModels, right? We need to use vModels to connect these fields to the state of the component. Right now we know that we can say constant, let's say first name, like this is equal to ref, right? And then we put this blank. Again, this needs an import. So we say import ref from view, right? And then we come here, and we say v dash model. This is what links it to the variable, right? First name. All right, good. So we know that part works, and it can also work for last name as well. So we can do something like this is equal to ref, and we can do this for all of the variables, right? And we can come to last name and we can say v model is equal to last name, and this will link that field to the last name variable. And if we want to display this, we can just come here, for example, and just say v dash row like this here, right? All right, v dash row, and we can just display the first name and we can see where as we type, that's typed, right? So that's one way of actually doing that. All right, so that's one way of doing this. Now, another way is to create an object, all right, that will that will represent the structure of the form information you want to gather. All right. So let's quickly look at our form. So we have a first name, last name. Then we have a VRadio group, which has the two buttons for 6, and then we have the email address and the password section below. All right. So let's start with just the first name and last name. So instead of having this, what we would actually do is to say constant. Then we can say, let's call it user info, right? And we say it's equal to ref, and we make it like this. Good. And what we want us to log instead is user info. So let's log this, right? So it's empty. Good. Now, now what we can do here is that we can say first name, right? Give it a value. Last name, give that a value. We will then replace these two. They should break the program. It won't work because there is no first name anymore. And this is now user.info, user info dot first name, and user info dot last name. All right. And now, as you can see, it works. All right. So what we're doing here is that instead of using a single variable for each field, we're creating an object and we're using its properties as the fields. All right. This is why we need to say the dot first name and the dot last name. All right. Um, and we can continue this for email address. Let's do email address. So email, leave that blank, and then password. Right. And then we leave that blank as well. So as we type, but we didn't connect these. All right. So those won't work because we need to come up here. We need to then say here as well, v dash model is equal to user info dot email, and for the bottom we need to say v dash model is equal to user info dot password, and we save. All right. So now as we type this should work, right? So this all works. Good. And the last one that remains is this, right? The section with sex. So to do that, we'll come to Vuetify, we'll come to components. We need to look at the radio buttons. And then this is, here we have it, right? So we have, it has a label and it has a value. Good. So if we come here, we can see the code. So we have a radio group. The radio group needs a V model. And then each radio needs a button, a label, and a value. So we only have labels here. So we need to add the values, right? So value for this one is going to be male, and the value for this one is going to be female. Good. We can come to script, and as you, this is using the options API, not the composition API, but it's not difficult to understand. It's so if we come here, we can see that this is radios, and this value here was 1, and then this has a value of 1. What this basically is telling you that the whatever the V model of the radio group stores which option we selected, right? So we need to have an option for that. So sex, and then we do that. So we're leaving it blank, and then we come here, and is here we need to put a V model, right? Not on the actual radio buttons. Let's see if that works. So we have sex there, and it does not work. That's all right. Let's try to refresh. Oh, this is incorrect, right? This has to be user info. dot sex. And there it works, right? So we have a right, and that works. Now, what's missing here? Well, first of all, this password field should hide the password. So this password is a text field, so it simply means that we need to come to wherever the text field is, and it may not be here. Let me try this password. Oh, password input. Um, all right, password input, and then we have a login form example. Okay, so for password input, we come here, we look for the field. There's a mud, there's an icon, rules, type hint, counter. So the type is password. So we need to set type as password, all right? So we come to where our password is. We then say type is equal to password. And yeah, it works. Good. So that is also working. Next, what we need to do is to get this clear and this submit button to work, right? So when the clear button is pressed, we simply want to clear the form. So we need a function for that. So we just say function clear, right? And the trick that you would use, because you want it to essentially return to this default status, right? So one trick you can do is to say function init, or that is initialize user, right? Or the initial user, and you just say return this, right? And here you call init user, like this, right? So let's get rid of that, save. So as you can see, it has its initial state. But now, all right, so, and as you can see, therefore that returns the initial user, and then the clear function is going to be very straightforward. Function clear, and we need to say user info that value is equal to init user. And then we need to actually call this function. So at click, when the clear button is clicked, we're calling clear. So now if we fill in this form and we press clear, it clears. All right. Next, we want to do, well, I can get rid of this logging here. Next, we want to do submit. And well, submit is basically the same thing. We create a function called submit. It can name anything you want it, right? I'm just naming it submit. Submit. And when this button is clicked, at click is equal to submit. Now remember, you can either put a function name or you can call it. Both will work, right? The calling version allows you to pass in additional parameters, right? So both of them would work. And what we just want to do is to say console.log, and we want to say JSON dot, sorry, console.log user info dot value. So when you're working with a JavaScript part of the component, you need to use that value before you can access the variables, right? Or these properties. Whereas when you're working in the HTML part, you don't need to use that value, right? You don't use that value, right? So for example, down here it's first name, it's user info dot value dot first name, whereas up here it's just user info dot first name, all right? And then console.log would actually print things here to the console. So if I clear this, fill this in, submit, you should see it on the messages, right? And here's the information. All right, so that is the very basic aspect of getting user input. Of course, we don't user input also includes actual front end validation. In this section of the video, we'll look at conditional rendering. All right, so if you come to Vue.js.org, you click on Get Started, you click on conditional rendering, you can see the Vue documentation related to conditional rendering here. All right, so there are two ways of doing this. On one, you have the basic if-else statement, and Vue supports that. So it's simply used. This is a Vue directive. For now, we'll just call them properties because attributes because they look like HTML attributes, right? So it's v if the first condition, and then you can have else. All right. So this is standard if else statement. You can also have it like this, where you have if, else if, and else. So it supports the standard um, Vue if else statement that you have. It supports the standard if else statements that you have in many different programming languages. All right. So let's integrate this into our um, farm. So here we have our farm, and we're simply going to put right here. We'll ask them if they would like to state their sex, and if they select yes, then we are going to display the section where they select sex. All right. So in order to do that, all we need to do is to put another checkbox, another radio group here. All right. And we're going to display the options yes and no. So to start things off, I'm just going to copy this, and we have a different Vue model because we don't want to store these options, the yes and no option, in the user info. So this is going to be yes, label and value, and then no, label and value. All right. So that's the yes and no um, that we have there. But we then need a Vue model to save whether they press yes or no, because you have to know which one they selected. All right. To do that, Another important concept when it comes to dealing with Vue is how to do looping. So Vue supports the for loop, and if you come to vuejs.org/guide essentials and you select list rendering, you're going to see that for loop. Now, the for loop is very straightforward. It's v-for, then you see items in items, or this can actually be anything. This is just the name of the variable, the reactive variable constant, and in each iteration of the loop, the variable item will take on the value of one of the elements of items. All right. Um, and again, there are many different ways of doing this. This is also another syntax. In this case, this in items part is the same, but prior to that, you have bracket with two variables. Here, you have access to the item and the index of the item. All right. Again, that's very straightforward. Now, there is another one I want to show you. It can also apply to objects, all right? And when you apply to an object, what's actually happening is that you are going to be going through the properties of that um, object, right? Title, author, published at. If you pass an object into the for, you'll go through the properties. And if you use this approach, you can get the value and the property. And in this syntax, you can get access to the index, the value, the key as of the properties, right? Um, in this case, we'll cover the basic arrow usage. The others are just here so that you know uh, that those exist. But the way we're going to be doing this mainly is using the arrows, right? Using a standard array, sorry. So let's come back to our form here, and we'll just use a simple radio button to do a very basic list of regions. We'll ask them to select which region they're from, and we'll add it right to this form here. So to do that, first we need to create an array of something, right? So we'll create an array constant, we'll call it region, and then we will say ref. Um, in fact, let's just say thing like this. We'll use an array, sorry. So that's an array. And we are going to use an array of objects, right? And for each object, we are just going to put a title, or in fact, a name, the name of the region. I won't actually write out a long name because that's going to take too much time. 1, right? And we need another one for 2, another one for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All right. So as we saw before, there are many different ways in which you can do this. You can use a simple array. It can work with a simple array of numbers. It can work with an array of string. It can work with an array of objects. All of these things will work, right? And if you want, for example, you could add other properties to these objects that we have here. Good. All right. And now what we need to do is to render this as a loop, render it using a loop. So what I'm going to do is I'll put this above this question on sex, and we'll also be using a ready group. So what we'll do is we want to render, right? What we want to render are radio is a radio button for each region, and then allow the user to select the radio button from the region they're from, right? So to do that, what I'll do is I'll just say v dot group, v dot radio group, right? And we need a v model for the region that is selected. So I'll call this region list, or I'll just call this regions, and I'll have a v model called region, or a constant called region for the region itself, right? Let's give that an initial value of 0. Now, for the new v model, we use region here, and then what we want to do now is to render a radio button for each item in that region's array. So the way we do that is we say v-radio, right? Like this. And then we say v-for, like that. We're going to say item in regions. Regions is the name of the array that has all of the regions, right? And what I want to render in here, sorry, this probably won't work, but let's just try it, is item. But it actually worked, good. This is not what we actually want, right? We don't want just, as you can see, it rendered but a radio button for each item, but that's not what we want, right? What we want is in order for radio buttons to work, as you can see, it needs to be done here as a property, not within the between the open and closing tags, which is what we have here. All right. So in that sense, to simply display the region, so that's not what we're looking to do. Now, what we can do is to say label is equal to item dot name, and this one worked. All right, and then we want value to equal to item dot name as well, because remember that a radio button, right, has two properties that we need to add: the label and the value. So what we are saying, what we're doing here is that the variable item will take on each element in this region's array. And each element in this region's array is actually an object with a property called name, right? So we're going to set the label of the radio button to be equal to that item's name, and the value of the radio button to also be equal to that item's name. All right. Now, when you're using a loop, right, you need to distinguish between the different items in the loop. So that's what this error is telling you. It's telling you that custom elements in iteration require v.bind, right? So it's a custom element because this is a custom object, all right? So when you have that, you need a v-bind. So the shorthand for bind is colon key, right? The shorthand for v-bind is a colon. In the same way, the shorthand for v-on is an at sign, right? So this is a shorthand for doing the same thing, right? Um, and we can simply say item.name. We need to pass in something that is unique. We need to pass in a property that is unique in each element, right? That is unique in the elements across the array, sorry. So it has to be like an ID for each element. Now, as you can see, the name does not repeat, right? So because the name does not repeat and there are no duplicates in that name, it means we can use the name property of the item as a key identifier for each individual element that is rendered, right? So when you're using a for loop, of course, you can use it in this way, where you're doing list rendering and they're just rendering something in the body of the loop. This is very straightforward. But this approach is a bit different, but it works the same way. So the v-for, this part is going to run for every item in the regions array. It's going to render this array button, right? Because we're using a custom object, we need to say which is the identifying key in the object, the unique keys in the objects, right? Just like an ID. So in this case, we use colon key and we select the attribute. Then radio buttons now have labels and values. Those are the properties we need for a radio button to work. So here we're using labels, right? Just label. Here we're using colon label. So if you look at in this example, we're using label and the value is just a string literal, right? When you want to assign a variable value or a variable to a property in Vue, you need to use colon, the name of the variable. Sorry, colon, the name of the property, equal sign in brackets, the actual variable, right? This way, the label or the label of this radio button is going to depend on the value of this item name. So it's a way of this is how you hard code it, and this is how you make it dynamic. In a dynamic version, you need to put the colon in front. If I got rid of this colon, right there, it's just going to show the text item was name. If I want to see the value of it instead, I put a colon, and that's how that works. The same thing applies for value. If I get rid of the colon, well, it's not. This is not going to show, but if I were to log this, if I were to log or the display region, right? Um, you can see it's saying item.name, right? But if I am to instead put that, it's showing the actual value of what was selected, all right? So when you're using the for loop, again, is very straightforward. The thing that you want to repeat, that's another thing too. It's a thing that you want to loop, sorry, it's the UI element that you want to repeat that you put the loop on. So I'm not going to put the loop on the group because I want a list of radio buttons. I have to put the loop on a radio button, right? If I'm using a custom object, I have to say, okay, which key is unique across the elements in the array? And I use that as a key. And if I want to use elements of the array or any variable, as a matter of fact, as a value for a property, I need to bind it. So I need to use colon the property name, right? And that's basically it for loops in Vue. It's very straightforward to understand. Now, a common use case is combining a loop with an if. So it's not recommended to use if and for on the same element due to the implicit precedence, right? So when they exist on the same node, if has a higher priority than for, right? Which means that the if condition will have access to the variables within the scope of the for. So you understand what that means, right? So what this means is that if you do this, combine if with the for, right? The if has a higher priority than the for, which means if executes first, which means it doesn't have access to the elements of the for loop, right? The better way to do this is like this, all right? So you can wrap the actual the loop, use a template property for the loop, and then put the for loop within the template, right? Or sorry, the if statement within the template. The way this is going to work is the template is just a standard element. It's a generic Vue element, so you can do this. Also, it means that it's going to render the template multiple times, and it's only going to render the list items that meet this condition. So you don't want to combine these two like this. All right. Now, if you check conditional rendering, you will also see this, and it has the same warning, right? Or the same notice. And that is basically all there is for rendering loops in Vue. It's very straightforward and it uses a very standard for loop. The key thing to remember is just the syntax, all right? So Once you practice it a couple of times, you get that syntax right. It's not very difficult to comprehend.